I'm going to ask you to work very hard to try to understand and stop me and ask questions if it's not clear. Because the average person, I think, when I'm doing this will say, you lost me after 2 minutes or something. So let's try hard, okay? Let me use a kind of a strange story to open this topic. If you took...
If you started, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
We've got still a few people arriving that haven't come in. But
well,
it's time to go, I know.
It's 3 minutes after 6.
Let's go.
I'll wait a minute. Why don't we take a couple of questions, Joe, if people are walking in. Has anything come to your mind since we were together last time? Go ahead, please.
Is there an actual test to measure the insulin level?
Oh, sure.
What's it called?
An insulin test, but nobody's doing it. In other words, it's not part of any laboratory procedure that is common. But you go to any chemist and they could dream up some way to measure it. It's just nobody's doing it. And it's only been, what, 5, 6 years ago that I first heard the term type 3 diabetes. Kind of a funny term because technically speaking, diabetes is when the sugar's high. And all of those years, as long as the pancreas can keep pumping out more and more insulin, is the sugar elevated? No. So it's an interesting area, but I think the day is coming when that's going to start be looking at. But if you're, I was talking to a physician friend, I don't know if I told you, this has only been, well, several months ago, in another town in Southern California where we spend some of the winter. And he said to me, Jim, you know that everybody that's overweight has insulin resistance. Is what this doctor said. He's well informed because he's kind of in that world of worrying about this. Anybody else, please? Kathy, right?
Yes. So do you know what level of insulin you're supposed to have and anything above that?
I couldn't give you the actual number, but when somebody is living wisely, it does take insulin to up and down, keep the sugar normal, and the body does that just fine. And the body keeps the sugar normal even over that time, doesn't it? Except the problem is, it's wearing out the pancreas, correct? And, of course, it's doing all kinds of damage in the brain. So that high level of insulin in the blood that's passing through the brain causes these things that you all have heard about, these evidences that the brain has that it's becoming the condition of type 3 diabetes or Alzheimer's disease.
This is off the topic a little bit, but
Okay.
it's a good question.
I'll repeat the questions, by the way. She's speaking so quietly, I'll repeat it.
Do you know why people thrive sugar? What? Why?
Oh, why do people like sugar?
Why do
It tastes so good. It tastes so good.
how do you get away from it?
She asked, why do people, crave sugar? Well, it tastes good. Well, here's the thing that I think is wonderful, and I don't want to embarrass Neva. She's not even here right now. I can talk about her. She went to the store to get something. God has blessed that girl. I said this already. She has spent our 56 years of marriage learning how to make healthy food taste good. And you haven't had that much of her food to know, but everybody that eats at her table, I'll tell you folks, they say this is fabulous. You'll get a little taste of it this evening. It's the way we were created, I guess, to like sugar. But listen, folks, if we didn't refine the foods, you can eat all the sweet fruit you want, and it's okay. Y'all with me on that? There are people who are fruitarians. They want to eat only fruit, and it turns out that's okay. And I'll repeat myself. You could take almost any plant, and if you ate enough of it so you got enough calories, you probably do just fine. So the idea that you have to have some of this or have to have some of that, don't go there. Just eat plants. Okay, here we go. This is a funny little illustration, but stay with me. You got a cube of butter. You cut it in half. Is it still butter? Say yes. Cut it in half, is it still butter? And again, and again. Finding a magnifying glass, still butter? Microscope, still butter? Electron microscope, still butter? There comes a time if you cut it again, it's not butter. And we call that tiny piece, before we cut it one more time, you know this word, it's a molecule of butter, or actually a molecule of fat. Butter is essentially pure fat. There might be several different kinds of fat in that butter, or different amounts of different kinds of fat. So I'm going to put a drawing on the board of what that looks like, that last little piece before you cut it. And I've got it colored. It's not colored like this. I do it just to kind of differentiate. And it has a top on it, which actually is glycerin. That red piece. Where do you find glycerin every day in your house? Mainly in soap, or face cream, or various things that manufacturers make for us to put on our bodies. So you know the term, don't you? Glycerin. You might not have. And it's got a chemical shape. I'm not even going to bother with that. Now, what we're looking at, folks, is one molecule of fat. Are y'all with me on that? Way, way too tiny to see, even with an electron microscope. But you get 100 billion, zillion of them, and you have a cube of butter, right? Now, I've colored the legs differently. We call this thing triglyceride. Why the tri? Because it's got 3 legs. And glycer comes from glycerin. And chemists like to use this term IDE, fastened on, to tell you that things were hooked together. Chemically, electronically, actually, is how they hold together. We say chemically, but it's all electricity. So a triglyceride. You all know the word, don't you? There's a common synonym for that. Anybody know what it is? It's the word FAT. Please get this. Fat triglyceride. Synonyms completely. All right. By the way, if you cut one of those legs off, what would it be? A diglyceride. Have you ever heard the term? Sure you have. It's in the ingredients on the back of the candy bar. And maybe you haven't, but are y'all with me on the idea? What if you cut 2 legs off? A monoglyceride. Now listen to this. Companies, knowing that you don't want any fat or triglycerides, if you knew the term, they will put monoglycerides and diglycerides in there, and then you think, oh good, there's no fat there. But a pound of diglycerides, just say a pound, your body will turn into, guess what? A pound of triglycerides. And a pound of monoglycerides, same thing. Y'all with me on that idea? I'd love to take the time to show you how that happens, but time is of essence. They tell me I have to stop on time tonight so you can have supper. So here we go. Now, the legs, you know this word too, don't you? And I try to remember that this word fatty acid just refers to the legs of the fat molecule. Are y'all with me on that? Because there's a little gadget at the top, I'm not even trying to draw it, that makes that leg an acid. A little cute little chemical gadget up there. That's all I want to bother you with right now. So they are, why do they call them fatty acids? Because they're part of the fat piece, right? The fat molecule. You've all heard the word fatty acid, haven't you? Probably had not much of an idea what it meant. All right. Now, actually this leg, all three of them, is actually diesel. By the way, does corn have fat in it? Every plant does. You can buy corn oil. Have you ever heard about biodiesel? They take corn and cut the legs off and sell you the diesel. That's where it comes from. The legs are actually diesel. And something else interesting about these legs is that they're actually just a string of carbon atoms. Now, I don't want to scare you because I'm putting chemicals on the screen. You all know what carbon is. A little chunk of charcoal. What is charcoal mainly? It's carbon. And you can burn it and get energy. Now, in the leg, this fatty acid leg, can you see on the screen, is it big enough to see that each of those little things on the sides are H's? What do you think that is? It's hydrogen. And there's a tremendous amount of energy in this leg. I don't know if you ever did this in high school chemistry, but if you take a little vial of hydrogen that you create for the kids in front of them, and it's so light that you have the little thing upside down that's got hydrogen in it, and you bring a match over here and you tip this and the hydrogen comes out and goes boom, sort of. Lots of energy in these legs. Interestingly enough, if there's only 8 there, if there were only 8, it would be octane. What's octane? Gasoline. So these legs on the triglyceride are diesel, and if they were shorter, they would be gasoline. And is there a lot of energy in gasoline? Just a cup of it will drive your car about 5 miles down the road. You try to do that by pushing the car. Would it take some energy? Yeah. So the point is, folks, that fat is just loaded with energy. And the problem is, tonight when you go to bed, and of course all of you are behaving yourselves now, but any calories that you ate today that you did not burn, either because of metabolism in your body, does it take some energy to keep you alive? Lots. 1,500 calories a day. All the energy that we ate that we didn't burn up, the body will convert it into fat. Now, the reason the body does that, folks, I've told you this, there's only 3 sources of energy: fat, carbohydrate, and protein. Remember that? I told you this, and you can't remember all this stuff, but fat has more than twice as many calories per pound, per any amount, as the other 2. You got that? So the reason the body changes all these calories that you ate that you didn't burn up with walking or thinking or whatever, waving your arms, etc., it's the most efficient way to store the energy. Does that make sense? You can put more energy in the fat than if you made it into protein or carbohydrate. And so the body takes those fat molecules that it makes out of the energy you didn't burn up and stuffs it into cells here and there. And of course you all know, we talk about fat cells. Well, the body can put that into any cell in your body, and it does. Well, in any case, that would be octane. Let's go back to our 3 legs. How many of you are already lost? Let me see your hands. Who should have raised their hand that didn't? I'm doing better than, you're doing better than I thought. Okay. If the legs are straight, the fat is solid at room temperature. And in fact, we used the term saturated. I didn't put it on the screen. I thought I had. If the legs are bent, the fat is liquid at room temperature. Give me some examples of fat like that. Just quickly give me an example. I'll come back to you in a second. Now wait a minute. The legs are straight. What's the nature of the fat at room temperature? What's the nature of the fat at room temperature? It is solid. Give me some examples. Somebody said butter. Coconut oil is not. Okay, now this is an interesting question. Room temperature for coconut oil. You're exactly right. If the room is quite warm,
It's going
it's going to be liquid. But you're right. In fact, for the sake of interest, what makes the legs straight, folks, is they're saturated with hydrogen. You all with me on that? If you didn't, you know it now. Remember the hydrogens I drew along the sides? If there's none of them missing, we say it's saturated. And I'm telling you that saturated fat is what at room temperature? Solid. And coconut fat, coconut oil, is 96% fat saturated. So it's pretty close to being saturated, and it would be liquid even at very warm temperatures. Of course, any fat, if you get it warm enough, will become liquid, won't it? That's why we say room temperature, which is just, a rough figure. If the legs are bent, there's the solid. If the legs are bent, the fat is liquid at room temperature, whether it's one bend or more. And so what do you suppose? If these legs are saturated, every carbon has hydrogens. What do you suppose is happening here? Let me get back there again. There's some hydrogen missing, and so the legs bend where there's a missing hydrogens. So we say it is that is to say, it's not saturated with hydrogen. See, a little less energy, not much less, but a little less. And it's liquid at room temperature, or unsaturated. You know all those words, of course. You probably didn't know the connection of all of these. If there's only one bend, we call it, are y'all with me on that? You all know the term, don't you? Monounsaturated. And if there's more than one bend, guess what? Polyunsaturated. Now, let's just stop for a minute. Remember, these individual legs, we call them fatty acids, correct? When three of them are hooked to this soapy material, what do we call it? It is a fat. And if it happens to be just two were hooked up to this stuff, kind of that's in soap, what do you call it? A diglyceride. You know these words, don't you? I have a little video clip. I won't show it tonight. Probably the last time we're together, maybe I'll try to remember to show it. But there's a lady that is in the film Eating You Alive. And I don't know if I've mentioned that before, but for $10 you can buy this. For $3 you can rent it from YouTube. This is a fabulous film. And somebody asked my wife or somebody the other day, how do I know that this guy knows what he's talking about? And I was tempted, and I actually started to there's about 25 physicians in this film. All of them are saying the same thing. I played you the one from Esselstyn where he said, what were the exact words? Oil in an olive, oil here, oil there. Remember that? Talking about the problems with that. But there's 25 physicians in that film who have educated themselves, listen to me carefully, all saying the same thing. Are you with me on that? And a couple of them are famous. John McDougall is in that film. And Caldwell Esselstyn. John McDougall is the one that I put on the screen last night who said 100% of heart disease is reversible, 100% preventable. Caldwell Esselstyn is the one who wrote the book, How to Reverse Heart Disease. The guy from University of San Francisco, who did the first studies to show that you could make plaque go away. And on it goes. Credible people all teaching the same thing. So if that person is here and you wondered, what I'm sharing with you folks is not just some idea that I have. I've spent my life learning these things from experts, and you can do the same thing. But each of these legs, I'm going to take one of them off just for the sake of clarity and put it on the screen. It has the shape of a letter of the alphabet. What letter? Now, scientists like to make us think they're smart. I'm teasing a little bit. But instead of using some English letter to describe this fat, they use the Greek letter, which is shaped like this, which is in the shape of a W, but the name of that letter is omega. Have you ever heard the word omega used in connection with a fat? Of course you have. And this is free. I don't know why I'm doing this when I need time, but have you ever heard of the variation of COVID that some people call Omicron? It makes me want to scream every time I hear it, because those newscasters haven't bothered to learn how to pronounce the word. There's 2 letters in Greek that are used for an O sound. In English, if we write an O, we have to tell you if it's an A or if it's O. Am I right? In Greek, whenever you see this symbol, the name of that is omega, it is always, no exception, pronounced O. We say the long O. When you see this one, the name of that is Omicron. And it's always, I don't care where those letters occur in the Greek words, they're pronounced. The second one I wrote, A, or what do we call that sound? The short O, isn't that correct? And the one that looks like a W, we pronounce O. O. So what should this variation be called? Omicron. That's free. No charge for that whatsoever. I finally heard a newscaster today say Omicron. Good for them. Anyway, the sinus, because this, you understand, this is a fatty acid. This is a leg, right, of a mono, di, or triglyceride. And we call it an omega fatty acid because of that shape. And it turns out that the only difference, and by the way, all of these 6 legs hooked up to their tops are what kind of fatty acids? Omega. They are omega fatty. Are y'all with me on that? Because if you turn them flat, what letter do they look like? W, or omega. Okay. The only difference between omega-3 and omega-6 is the number of carbons from the end. You all know about omega-3 and omega-6, don't you? You had no clue what that meant. But now you know, right? Don't say no. Can you see that omega-3s, the first bend is closer to the end? And omega-6s, it's farther from the end. And what I don't show on this slide, so let me just point here. Well, I do sort of. There's 1, 2, 3 carbons before you get to the bend. Y'all with me on that? Because I showed you that the chains are actually chains of what? Of carbon atoms hooked together with hydrogens on them, which is a wonderful way to store energy. Now, let me sidetrack here. I don't have slides on this. Shape in chemistry is a huge issue. It's almost like the key in a lock. If you come up here and you put the wrong key in the door back there, will it turn? Why? It's because of the shape. Chemistry is like that. Shape, you could almost say shape is everything. It isn't, but it is a huge issue. So omega-3s act differently than omega-6s. Are you with me on that? Because of their shape. And you all know that omega-3s are good for you, right? They're good fats, if you will. And omega-6s, I'll show you that there's issues there in just a moment. Okay. You're lost by now, correct? Ask me a question that might help clear something up. Anybody brave enough? Well, they don't have separate names. It's just that in the product you buy, they will tell you how much of it is omega-3 or omega-6. But once it's an omega-3 fatty acid, it doesn't have a separate name. It's just how much of it is there, or is some even there at all. Good question. Yeah, any plant has omega-3 in it and omega-6. No exceptions. Every animal has fat in it in probably various proportions of those. The issue isn't so much whether you're getting 3 or 6. The issue is, are you getting too much? That's what's killing Americans. Are y'all with me on that? And There is something I'll show you in a few minutes about the comparing the two. But omega-3s are, everybody knows they're the healthiest kind, and that actually is correct. Somebody else asked me a question. If you can figure out in this mass of confusion something to ask me that might help you. Anybody?
Since the sixes are worse than the threes, what would be a six? Like, the carrot's a six?
Well,
or
notice what I said. Every plant has fat in it. Are we all clear on that?
Yes.
And every plant has some saturated fat in it, not very much, except for a few plants that are high in saturated fat. And every plant will have some 6 and some 3, some higher than others. You don't need to worry about that fact. Don't say, oh, I want to buy this because that has more omega-3. No, 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 no. Just eat plants, and you don't have to worry about it. But because you get all kinds of messages from the industry and whatever, I'd like to have you have a little background in this topic. See, this is what's fat for you and what isn't. That's where I'm trying to go. A little bit of understanding on this whole thing. All right. And those legs are all essentially diesel. By the way, fat is, what would you say, greasy, slippery? Have any of you ever noticed, I suppose mainly the men who are pouring, that diesel is a little oily? In fact, they actually call it diesel oil because it is a hydrocarbon and is long enough. I don't know if you picked this up. I should have mentioned it. When you have 8 of those carbons, what do we call it? Gasoline, right? You just make it longer and it gets greasier. Make it longer and it gets grease. Longer, longer, sticky grease. Interesting the way our world has been put together. Now you probably know, maybe not. Oh, sure, you've heard of this, that you need some EPA and DHA. You've heard it now. And in fact, ALA, I could give you the names. Alpha-linolenic acid is plentiful in plants. And EPA and DHA, what does it say? So uninformed people will tell you, you've got to eat some salmon to get some EPA and DHA. Have any of you ever noticed that at the health food store, you can buy a bottle of DHA? Have you ever noticed that? Or it'll tell you how much EPA or DHA is in it, and you want to buy that, and you need that. And the people that do that are uninformed. Here's what's going on. It is correct, friends, that EPA and DHA, and those are actually just longer. ALA is 18, and EPA is 20, and DHA is 20. That's all. It's just a longer chain, but it does have the bends in it that make it look like a what? Like a W or an omega Greek letter. So if EPA and DHA are not found in plants, then I need to eat some salmon or something, right? Say no. So what's the answer? The answer is, and I've put the lengths of them there for you. The body can easily add 2 more carbons to ALA and make EPA. Who said that? Where's Neva? She's not back yet. I was going to tell her, don't give that man a cookie. I was putting those cookies this afternoon in the container to bring them here, and I thought to myself, I should eat one of these and tell Neva I had an accident. Anyway, the body, folks, can add a couple of carbons to the chain, or can add 4 carbons to the chain and make all the EPA and DHA we need. Got it? Pretty cool. Chemistry. You know, you can take a course in biochemistry. You can get a PhD in biochemistry, and you have to actually learn the actual chemicals that cause it to happen and what the steps are. A good question, but way beyond what we're doing in this room. Okay. I've studied biochemistry, but it's not my field, so I would actually have to look it up to tell you just exactly how it's done. I got a graduate degree in biochemistry, but I mean, it was a large portion of what we studied. Okay. What about these two? And I'm sorry that you won't ever see this in the common literature, but in the scientific literature, they stopped using the letter omega and they just say N6 or N3. So if you want to read that, the way I could read it for you, omega-6 fatty acids are converted in the body using a fancy chemical into something called, pronounce it for me. You've heard the word, haven't you? And also into, you've never heard that word maybe, leukotrienes. Here's the problem. Don't even worry about those words. This is what you kind of should know, which contribute to the pathophysiology. What do we use this word path or patho? What does that mean? Disease. Physiology means the operation of our bodies. So omega-6 fatty acids can become poisons to us and get us asthma and other symptoms. You can read them. Airflow obstruction, bronchoconstriction. It turns out that if I get the right amount of omega-3s with the 6s, that does not happen. And that kind of comes back to this thing, don't refine the foods, eat them whole, right? But this is a correct evaluation. Let me tell you some more. So there's a desirable ratio of 6s to 3s. Are you with me kind of still, I hope? And it should be about 4 to 1. When you have that ratio, there's a lot of health outcomes that are very, very good. When the ratio gets higher than that, it's bad. This is the average typical American diet. What do you think about these ratios, the 15 and 30? Good or bad? This is just the way Americans eat. And when you see, folks, what happens because of this poor ratio, it ought to blow your mind. You wouldn't be surprised that a whole plant regimen is just about where it ought to be. Now, go ahead. When you eat plants, it's the perfect ratio. Correct. When you buy stuff that somebody made and put in the store, bad news. And the reason is, folks, the N6 or the omega-6 fatty acids are so cheap. So guess what all the restaurants use? Cheap oil. Bad news, folks. It's crazy what Americans do not know about themselves and what they're eating. It's crazy. And these are not my ideas, folks. This is out of the literature. I'm sure you get that. Now notice what this is. Proper ratios, even up to 4 to 1. I'm going to stop at each white writing and ask you to read it. These proper ratios are associated with what? All together now. From cardiovascular disease, that's heart disease. They're also associated with what? You all know, don't you, that inflammation is bad for you, right? All kinds of issues because of inflammation. I'm sure you're aware of that to some degree. Especially people that have rheumatoid arthritis. And guess what? A decreased risk of what? Asthma, arthritis, vascular disease, blood clotting, immune inflammatory processes, and what? Listen, folks, a tumor starts growing somewhere in your body. And we won't have time while I'm with you, but I have a couple of lectures on cancer that I would I'm going to do a little bit of cancer. What is it, Sunday night? When did we meet the last time? Sunday night. It's fascinating stuff, folks, how much you can do to prevent or stop the growth of cancer cells. Anyway, you know this. A tumor starts growing somewhere, and before long, it starts, if you will, sending off cancer cells. That's what I'm sure you get this. That's what they're referring to when you have tumor proliferation. So when you have a proper ratio of 3s to 6s, it suppresses tumor proliferation. Got it? Incredibly interesting issues that the average American knows nothing about and ought to. Let me show you something that's even more mind-blowing. No, we're doing not too bad. What's that blue thing at the top? It's an omega fatty acid. One of the legs, correct? And when it's exposed to oxygen, these bends actually allow the oxygen to break them into pieces. And these pieces, each of them is an oxidized portion and is toxic. We've talked about this a little bit. I didn't begin to explain it in detail. And those are inflammatory. They are called free radicals. And I told you almost at the start, what else could we say about those pieces? They are carcinogens. Are y'all with me on this? You remember that? What causes this to happen? Exposing the fatty acid to air. Now, when the fatty acid is in the food, there are chemicals in the food that protect it from being oxidized. But when you extract the oil, listen, the moment you take the oil out of a walnut, out of corn, it's going to be exposed to air. Even at these low temperatures, it is already oxidizing. Well, orange juice has fat in it just like oranges do, but right now we're talking, I'm talking about the fat itself. It's a good question. I'm not talking about the food, the whole food. Right? I'm talking about the fat. But when you take fat out of corn or whatever else, it's pure fat pretty much, isn't it? And it starts and becoming a carcinogen, friends. Do you remember I talked to you about the heart study where they, let me just review this. I hope you got this. You can take any plant fat, and because plants are low in saturated fat, you can take the same amount of fat from a person and give them this, and they will get 56% death rate from heart disease. Do you remember that? Any plant fat. Because plants tend to be low in saturated fat. And you understand that saturated fat is a big participator in making heart disease. You all got that, didn't you? So I'm just connecting with something we said earlier. But even the plant fats that, if you will, are omega-3s, when you expose them to air, they start oxidizing, friends. We need to quit using free fats. You all with me on the idea? And those pieces are, another word we use is rancid. They're free radicals and they are carcinogen. Where I was going with the heart thing, I lost my train of thought. Do you remember that the 2 hospitals in Finland where they took their milk and took the animal fat out and put soy oil back in? Same amount of fat? And they gave them margarine, which had plant fat instead of all saturated fat like butter, and they reduced the death rate. In that one, it was 46%, I think. What actually happened, that even if the public heard about those studies, they had this big decrease in heart disease. What actually happened? Do you remember when I was making this statement? I tried to find a couple in here. The increase in cancer was high enough, so watch this, friends, the overall death rate did not change. Astonishing that these things are known to the scientific community. And I say this somewhat kindly, the manufacturers of the food don't even know this. Now, actually, almost any food manufacturer will have a chemist who's there to be watching over all these things, and you can actually call the companies up. Now, when I call up and I say, may I speak to your food chemist, I always identify myself as a scientist, and they might let you speak to them anyway, but I've done this many times, and they transfer me to this guy or this lady with a PhD who's the food chemist for that company. And I have a couple of questions that have come to my mind to find out, and they're pretty helpful to tell me, and they probably would talk to me more easily because of my background. I understand that, but I'm just wanting you to get the picture. So, free radicals, and when I say potential damage to cellular DNA, I haven't told you this yet, I don't think, but there is no exception to this. All cancer is the result of mutations in the DNA. You all know the word DNA, you kind of know that's the hereditary thing, and we'll look at that briefly Sunday. So they're carcinogens. Now watch this. How many of you ever took chemistry in high school? Can I see your hands? Super. Besides those who just raised their hand, how many took it in college? Anybody? 2 or 3, 4? Your teacher taught you, you may not remember this, that if you have a reaction, teacher gives you a couple of reagents, we call them, a couple of different chemicals, and you're going to mix them together and something's going to happen. Something strong or maybe not so strong. If you increase the temperature of those two containers of chemicals by 10 degrees, the explosion will be twice as strong. Y'all with me? Let me tell you a place where, of course, you don't know about this in, I'm teasing you. You don't know about this down here in Arizona, where I live. The opposite is true. Every 10 degrees you decrease the temperature, the chemical reaction is 1/2 as strong. And in my car, as is in yours, there is a battery. Is that a chemical reaction that creates the electricity? Yes. Every time the temperature goes down 10 degrees, the power of the battery is 1/2. And I remember one, oh, I got to quit telling you stories because we're running out of time. Can I tell you anyway? If we have time at the end, remind me. Now, if the fat is not extracted from the plant, oxidation is very slow. If you leave a walnut up on the shelf long enough, will it get rancid? Sure. What we do, folks, when we buy nuts, we buy them in quantity. We put them in the freezer. Why would we do that? 10 degrees, 10 degrees, 10 degrees, 10 degrees, to try to keep the oxidation as low as possible. Then we'll take smaller amounts and put them in the refrigerator, and we'll use them, and whatever's left put right back in the refrigerator, just to try to limit as much as possible. Now watch what happens the way you used to cook. Now, by the way, it's centigrade. You know, in the chemistry world, it's centigrade and not Fahrenheit. It doubles the reaction rate of any chemical reaction. Let's take some oil off the shelf, some nice, healthy olive oil, which we've heard is really good for you. And let's say it's at room temperature, about 20 C. And I put it in the frying pan and fry some potatoes or whatever. And the temperature will be about 450 degrees. How many tens are there between 20 and 230? Stop a minute. Are y'all with me how I'm doing this? You understand? I'm 10 degrees, 10 degrees, 10 degrees. How many tens are there between 20 and 230? 21. Follow me, friends. This is insanity. Every 10 degrees increases the oxidation rate by 2 times. And if you multiply 2 times 2 times 2, 21 times, well, I'll do it for you. The difference is 2 tens. So can you see it's 21 times? 21 times we're adding 10 degrees. A lot of you have played around with computers and spreadsheets. All you have to do is type it in and it will calculate it for you. Here's a picture of my spreadsheet with that calculation right there. How many times faster is this thing oxidizing as you fry whatever you're frying? Read it to me. 2 million times, folks. What we do to our bodies is insanity. We think nothing of it. So all of Neva's recipes, whenever they need to be heated or whatever, she has found ways, often by using Teflon frying pans. Now everybody has heard that Teflon's bad for you. That's an incorrect statement. If you get the Teflon above 560 degrees Fahrenheit, it will start to break down chemically and give off some chemicals that are bad for you. But the Teflon essentially is perfectly safe. What is the temperature I'm frying this food at? And so Neva often uses some water, perhaps, a little. You look in her recipes, nothing in that whole cookbook, all 250 recipes, folks, nobody's frying in oil. Are y'all with me? So it's possible to do this. But isn't this just crazy beyond belief what Americans are doing to themselves? Now, it's true that if you fried in saturated fat, the saturated fat doesn't break down nearly as much. But is frying in saturated fat good for you? No. So we've learned, folks, to make our foods more healthfully, to be sure. Now, in closing, have you ever heard of trans fatty acids? Of course. That word trans, and another word with it you've never heard of probably, cis, are Latin prefixes which describe the position or the orientation of the hydrogen at the bend. Did I show you that fatty acids were bent? Right? So at the bend, there's hydrogen there, and I'll show you a picture. Now, you're probably a lot smarter than I am. I have to have crutches. And so I take the word cis, and I think same side. So if the hydrogens are on the same side, we call it a cis fatty acid. You with me? Sort of? I'll show you a picture. If they're a trans fatty acid, they're on the t'other side. Got it? Okay. Now, here's a picture from a chemistry textbook. Don't let this blow your mind. Can you see that I'm trying to depict a fatty acid with how many? Don't worry about these wiggles. And these black guys are carbons. A fatty acid with how many bends in it? Huh? One, you're afraid to say it. Are y'all with me on this? You're not saying yes. Look over to the left. Here's one leg, if you will, and here's the other leg. One bend. Are y'all with me? And in a chemistry book, when we know the hydrogens are there, we don't even draw them. You say, what do you mean? I don't know if they're there. Well, you learn. So on all of these, there's hydrogens hooked up on both sides, and we don't even draw them because we know they're there. I apologize for people that write chemistry books. But if I draw one here, what does that tell you? There isn't one over there. Got it? And if I draw one here, that's the same. So these two hydrogens, are they on the same side or the t'other side? Same side. So I don't know why the chemists, why don't they just say same side? They have to say cis. Well, that's the way they do. I think they're just trying to confuse the public. But this particular fatty acid, folks, is a cis fatty acid. Are y'all with me on that idea? And by the way, I won't, just a reference. This little gadget up here, one hydrogen and two oxygens, is what makes it an acid. So we call it, because it's a fat-like thing, we call it a fatty because this little gadget on the end is there. Now, imagine then grabbing this thing here. Imagine that this is a swivel. I'm going to pull it out in the air and fold it over here. Something like this. What has happened to this hydrogen here? It is now on the t'other side. Got it? There'll be a quiz before the meal tonight. And on whether or not you get that peanut butter cookie I almost ate. It turns out that saturated fats, I don't know if I made this clear, are straight. And that's why they're bad for you in comparison to fats that are bent. Are y'all with me on the idea? Does shape make a difference in chemistry?
Yes.
So straight is going to act differently than bent. Y'all with me on that idea? And it just turns out that heart disease is increased when the fatty acids are straight. And they're straight because they're saturated. Except in this case, there is a slight difference. But because these guys are straight, they're worse for you than bent ones. Are y'all with me on that? That's why trans fats are considered bad. Why hasn't the public been taught that saturated fats are bad? Why hasn't the public been taught that a trans fat is almost exactly the same as a saturated fat? Y'all with me? There are a couple of hydrogen missing, so the chemistry is slightly different, but the trans fats are bad for you. And hasn't the public been informed of that? And so you see something did you say no? You haven't heard it before, that trans fats are bad for you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Did you know that, was it de Blasio, who was the mayor of New York, and actually got the city council to vote? What do we call a law when a city council makes it? There's an ordinance. They actually made an ordinance that you could not sell any food in restaurants that had trans fats. And so the thing that bothers me about that is, first of all, I think government should stay out of it, but secondly, it gives the public the idea that everything's okay. Is everything okay with that thing straightened out? By no means. Now, who's the current mayor in New York? Pardon? Doesn't matter. They now made a law that you can't sell inside the city limits anything with trans fats. And of course the public, they have no clue, and they think that's wonderful, and they go ahead and carry on with their lifestyle. So I'm just illustrating here with the third drawing that the saturated fat is awfully close to the trans fat, and that's why the trans fats are bad for you. In fact, there's some indication that the trans might even be worse than the saturated fat, but it's awfully close to the same. Okay. Now here's the closing story. When I was a child, about 10 years old, I wanted my mother to teach me how to bake apple pies because I just love, you like pie? Anybody like pie? Oh, I love pie. And of course she taught me how to make the crust out of Crisco. I don't know if people even do this anymore. A couple, 3 tablespoons of shortening in the bowl, and put the flour in there, and you cut it with the knives and make the crust. And on the bottom of the can, you may remember this, it says, you can't read it here at all, saturated, what is the word after saturated? I think it says saturated fat, saturated plant fat or something. I should know that. Suddenly forgotten what exactly. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Hydrogenated vegetable oil, which means saturated. You all with me on this? You're adding hydrogens where they were missing, so the thing is straight instead of bent, correct? Okay. However, I don't know, 30 years ago, as this thing was learned that hydrogenated or saturated fat was bad for you, the people at Crisco said, aha, we will make Crisco with only partially hydrogenated, enough so that it is solid at room temperature. And the whole American public thought, isn't that wonderful? It's healthy now. Not true, of course. Now, follow this point. The only place, with the tiniest exception, that trans fats are created, follow me now, is in the partial hydrogenation of saturated fat. I'm sorry, the partial hydrogenation of plant fat. Remember, the plant fat is bent, right? 1 or more times. If you add hydrogen, and it's real easy to do, it will straighten it out. So when it says partial hydrogenation, it means only some of the fat in the vessel or the vat that you're doing this in a factory, only some of it was hydrogenated. Just enough so that when it cools, it's what at room temperature? Solid. That's what it means partially. It is, follow this please, it is in the partial hydrogenation process that trans fats are created. Can you just try to remember that? On a package?
And in the picture, it says 0 trans fat.
Oh, not now. It only says that when you fully hydrogenate it. Didn't I just say that there's actually a tiny, tiny bit of trans fats in animal products, but it's very small. The only place essentially where you find trans fats is in the partial hydrogenation of vegetable oils. Are y'all with me on that? Don't you remember 30, 40 years ago that everybody kind of heard that partial hydrogenation, oh, that's bad. Do you remember that? This is the reason, because the trans fats are being created. As though the saturated fats that are there are okay. You know, the poor public, they are just... So because of that, the can now says hydrogenated vegetable oil, fully hydrogenated. So this is the kind of thing that, of course, the public knows nothing about. It would be better not to use this in any case, and I'm sure you've heard me say that enough times. So trans fatty acids are produced by the partial hydrogenation of unsaturated fats. Exposure to oxygen breaks the fat into pieces, rancid pieces. Some of them straighten out, becoming trans. If the hydrogenation is carried on to completion, no more trans fats, but it's now saturated fat. In other words, it is the partial hydrogenation process which creates trans fat or trans fatty acids. And I think that's enough. I'd love to tell you more, but here I am, stopping on time. God bless you all.